Good morning, guys. This is going to be week 4 for Art at Home with Miss Walldorf. I'm going to be going out on my patio again with you today, but before I do, I want you to see our new household member. This is Carlos. Carlos is a cockatiel. This is his first day in our new home, so we're trying to leave him alone until he can get used to us, but we're excited about our new pet. All right, let me take you outside. Okay, the gist of our lesson today is going to be color theory. I'm going to show you the theory behind how colors work, and we're going to go over the schematic diagram. This is a diagram designed by people in order to help us understand scientifically how colors mix. And after I show you that, I'm going to paint a pear for you using that color theory. So I have set up for you on my plate the 3 primary colors, and you can see, and we call them primary because they're the basic colors that can be used to make all other colors. You can see the primary colors are popped out real big on my color wheel, and they are red and yellow and blue. And just to help you follow along, I've set those up the same way on my palette, which is just a paper plate today. And yes, I'm going to be using more traditional art materials because I couldn't think of a way to do that with just things from my fridge. There are 3 things that you can manipulate as an artist. The first one is hue. Hue just refers to a color. For example, you can mix yellow and red to make orange, and that is manipulating that color's hue. And then we're going to talk today about value, which has to do with the lightness or darkness of a color. And then we're going to talk about intensity to get today. Intensity has to do with how dull or how bright a color is. So when I finish, you'll see how to manipulate the 3 properties of color: hue, value, and intensity. Doing a color wheel exercise or creating this color chart along with me at home would be a really good way for you to build up an understanding of color theory. So there are my 3 primary colors, and if I mix my red and my blue together, I'm going to end up with a purple. That's a very dark purple. You may be having a little trouble seeing it. Even if I put a little red into it, it may be hard for you to see just because of the light out there, but that's my purple. If I mix my red and my yellow together, and I'm just going to do this directly on my paper. You could do it on your palette, but to save time, I'm going to just do this directly on my paper. Equal amounts of red and yellow mixed together are going to make orange. Yellow and orange, that's going to be another type of color in a minute. We're going to call that intermediate. Now, we talked about red, yellow, and blue. These 3 are our primary colors. If we mix the ones that are in between those, then we're talking about our secondary colors. So our secondary colors, by mixing red and blue together, are purple. Red and yellow together are orange. And if I mix blue and yellow together, then I'm going to get green. So there's my primary and my secondary colors. Now in between these are what we call intermediate colors. Some people call them tertiary. It depends on what term they were taught. Tertiary or third colors. That happens when you mix a primary color and a secondary color together. So if I mix yellow and orange together, then I'm going to have an orange that is a little more on the yellowish side. So put my yellow there. Then I think I'm going to take some of this orange that I made earlier, and I'm going to mix this into this, and this will be my yellow orange. In between yellow and green, if I take some of my yellow and mix it together with my green that I made, then this is going to make a yellow green. And I'm not trying to make my colors pretty. You could make a perfectly pretty chart by mixing your colors separately on another plate, but we're just doing a down and dirty quick coverage of this. Blue-green. This is going to be a green that has more blue in it. So if I take some blue and I mix that with some of my green, or make a green here real quick, and mix that in with my blue, then I'm going to have a green that is more on the blue side. Then, of course, you guys can kind of tell how these are going to go. If I mix my purple and blue together, I'm going to have blue-violet, and if I mix my red and my violet together, then I'm going to have a red-violet. So let me mix these up for you real quick. And my last one is if I take my red and my orange together and mix those together, I'm going to have an orange that is more on the red side. So if I take orange and I add red, red into it, then I'm going to have an orange that is more on the red side. Now, one really important color that I want to talk with you about is where you get a color that's a little more neutral. And this is getting into what I was talking to you before about lowering a color's intensity. If I mix all three of the primary colors together, I'm going to get a chromatic black. And we're going to be using that chromatic black in our Pear painting. So let's show you how to mix that. Now, if you mix them all together in equal amounts, it's going to look black or gray. Right now, I don't know if you can tell, but that's a little bit more on the purplish side. It looks kind of reddish purplish. So I'm going to add some more yellow into that to get it to be more of a dark black. But let me show you how this color can change. Let's say this color had a little more blue in it. Now that color is going to be a little more gray. I don't know, it's really hard to see the true colors just on my camera. Let's say that color had more yellow in it. Because you can make your chromatic blacks be a little more on the cool side, a little more on the warm side. Now that's looking a little more greenish, but it's still kind of dulled down. But when you mix those together, you're going to get colors that are duller, grayer, and you'll especially be able to see this when I start mixing white into these. Let me go get my white. And I'm going to show you what that looks like with some white mixed into it, and you'll see that it's going to look a lot more gray. See, that's a little bit more on the blue-gray side. And if my chromatic black were warmer, if I had more red mixed into it, then when I mix that with white, my gray is going to be a little more warm. So those chromatic blacks can give you a lot more complex color, and that's where you can start getting into realism. So the next thing we're going to talk about is value. Value has to do with the lightness or darkness of a color. So I'm going to use my red, okay? Right now, that's a high intensity red, and you'll notice that when we change the value of a color, it's going to change how intense it is also. But we're going to lighten this color, and then we're also going to darken this color. And to do that, I'm going to use my chromatic black that we made earlier, my red, red, yellow, and blue all mixed up. That's going to be my chromatic black. Because I try to tell my advanced students to mix up their own black and stay away from what's in the tube. So I'm going to use my red, okay? Right now, that's a high intensity red, and you'll notice that when we change the value of a color, it's going to change how intense it is also. But we're going to lighten this color, and then we're also going to darken this color. And to do that, I'm going to use my chromatic black that we made earlier, my red, red, yellow, and blue all mixed up. That's going to be my chromatic black. Because I try to tell my advanced students to mix up their own black and stay away from what's in the tube. Take some of my red, and I'm going to add some of that chromatic black into it. Mix it up, and you can see that it's getting a little bit darker, more crimson. And each time I add more of that chromatic black to it, it's going to get darker. All right, this time, instead of darkening a color, I'm going to lighten a color, and for that, we're going to need to use white. I'm going to start over again with my basic red, and every time I add white to this, it's going to get a little bit lighter. Okay, so we can mix a high intensity color into another color, we can darken it, and we can lighten its value. Now let's talk about intensity, and intensity is going to be super important for what we're going to be doing with the pear painting. And this time let's look at a different color. I'm going to be using a lot of yellow and orange in the pear that we're going to be using. So, let's see, this time let's use yellow and purple. I'm going to start with my yellow, and I'm going to paint, it's got a little bit of green in it, but you'll get the idea. I'm going to start with my yellow, and I'm going to be adding some purple into my yellow, and every time I add purple to it, you're going to notice that it's going to get a little bit darker, it's going to get a little bit duller, and eventually it's going to neutralize. Okay, I was using this other darker blue a minute ago, and it was really giving me a struggle. I need to pick a color to show you this with that's a little more vibrant. So I'm trying to exclusively work from my primary colors. I could go and I could get a tube of purple, and this would be working a lot more easily for this demo, but I want you guys to learn kind of in the most purest way how to get these going. I'm going to use a red that's a little more on the magenta side. It produces a prettier purple. And that's usually what we use in class when we're mixing, because people like the results better. So let's see if this looks more like purple to you now. There we go. So now we can see, hopefully, they still look kind of dark in the picture. Okay, I take my yellow and add a little bit of purple to it. It's still going to look yellow, but it's going to start to warm up. It's looking a little bit more on the brown side now. And every time I add some more purple into it, it's going to get duller, darker, more neutral. And when we say neutral, we're talking about brownish and grayish. And this really looks very brownish. And because I have experience with color theory, I knew this ahead of time. And if you'll do the same exercise or experiment with colors on your own, you will become more confident in picking colors and mixing colors on your own. And that just goes on and on. Every time I adjust this, every time I add more of that purple to it, it's going to get darker. And if I kept going, eventually it would start to turn yellow. The paint, I'm going to be painting this yellowish pear. Can you see why I wanted to show you these specific colors? You really can't get all of these varieties of colors without mixing them on your own. I tell my students, if you want your work to look professional, if you want your work to compete, if you want someone to look at your portfolio and be able to tell that you understand color, you need to stop working directly out of the tubes and start mixing the colors that you need by hand. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to prep a background, and this is going to be, you don't always have to do it this way, but I like working on top of a background. Now I could choose to make a really dark surface like that, or I could choose to mix up the color of the pear and cover it, or maybe I could choose to use that background color. I still see that background color a lot in the pear, and I think I'm going to start with a color that's not as dark as that and not as light as that, something that's in the middle in the darkest shadow like you see down here on the table. So I can save myself time, I'm going to start with a base color. I do see a lot of this warm color in there, but it's a little more on the yellowish orangish side. And when you're trying to mix a color up, I think that term orange-ish really helps. Does it need to be more bluish? Does it need to be more yellowish, more greenish, more brownish, orangish? Try to really think about how it relates to what's on the color wheel. I definitely think it needs to be a little more orangish, so I'm going to add more orange, and I know that orange is made up of red and yellow. All right, how am I doing? How does this compare? What does it need more of? Right, it needs more yellow. All right, I probably still need to add more yellow, but you know what? Close enough. You guys get the idea. And I'm just going to cover this using some consistent brush strokes. You don't have to worry about it being smooth, but you should try to cover it with a consistent series of brush strokes. So I'm going to use this same, either swirl or slash. You use whatever you prefer. So there's my ground for my pear. I'm gonna let this dry and then we'll come back. Okay, I'm back. I went in and made some lunch. My surface is dry. So now the next thing I would do is I would start by sketching on my pear. And you can sketch this on with pen or pencil or chalk. I'm just gonna sketch mine on with my paintbrush. And I'm thinking what I'll do is I'll sketch it on with the color that the pear is going to be. Now for that, you saw me mix this color earlier. This is a good base for that color. And it looks like it needs to be lighter. So, oops, didn't mean to get some color on my on my photo. So to make that lighter, I'm gonna need some white. I add that white into my pre-mixed color. And if you hold your paintbrush up to your work, or to your painting, you can see if that's a little more accurate. And to sketch, sometimes I kind of try to thin this out so it's a little easier to sketch with. It flows easier. I don't run out of paint as fast. Pears are organic and they don't all have the same specific shape. So it's okay to just kind of loosely sketch it with your paintbrush because no one's going to know if it doesn't exactly match that pear that you were looking at. Now, once I have that sketched on, then I can go ahead and just fill that in with my base color. And yours is not going to go just like mine. Don't worry if your colors don't match mine. Don't worry even if yours are a little warmer than mine or cooler than mine. But do play around with mixing colors that are a little more accurate. Learn how to make neutrals. Learn how to mix and make some colors that aren't right out of the bottle. And most important, have fun with it. My acrylic paint is kind of reflective, so it may be hard for you to see really what's happening. But we'll create some contrast a little later on, and that'll be a lot easier to see. So let's go ahead and put that contrast in. The contrast is going to be back here. That's going to be using my chromatic black that I made earlier. And that's going to show up right about here. And again, I'm going to sketch it on. You don't have to do yours just like mine. If you want to just put it on there kind of slapdash and thick, that's fine too. I feel like I have a little more control if I thin mine out. My color in my background is a little more on the purple. I'm sorry, a little darker. I can make it darker if I want, or I can leave it this color. I can even make it blue in the back if I want and just have fun with it. But since this is a color mixing exercise, I was going to talk to you about how to make those colors a little more accurately. I added some more blue back into it. And orange, blue and orange are across from each other on the color wheel. Right here. Blue and orange are across from each other on the color wheel. So play with mixing some variation of primary colors until you learn to make a chromatic black that's very, very dark. Okay, so there's my, I try to tell my students when they paint to do the shape, then the shadows and the highlights. The shape is the middle color. It's not the darkest and it's not the lightest. It's the middle tone. So I've got my shape, I have my background. We probably want to put a shadow in on the table. We could go ahead and do that now, and that would help us to be able to see the bottom of our pear a little better. For that, I'm going to take my chromatic black and I'm really going to thin that down because shadows are very transparent. They're more solid up against the edge of your form. And then they tend to fade as they're moving away. So I may even wipe my brush to take some of that off, so that'll fade as it moves away from the pear. And then I want it to be really dark up under here. Remember, that's an occlusion shadow that we may have talked about in a class. An occlusion shadow is up underneath your form. It's the part of your image that is receiving the least light. If you're having trouble seeing what your colors actually look like, try sampling them on top of some white paper. So there's my occlusion shadow. Let that darken up against my form, and then it fades as it moves away. And a lot of these are made with the same colors, all some combination of bluish, purplish, and orangish, yellowish. So it's made up of a lot of those same colors. We've custom mixed them. That helps enhance the unity in the piece. Now I'm going to go in and I'm going to start putting my shadow on. Remember I said for my advanced students, I'll tell them paint the shape of the subject, then do the shadows and highlights. So I'll use my reference photo to spot where my darkest shadows are, and this is a curved form. Since I know that this is a curved form, I'm thinning this down a little bit. That way it's blending with what's underneath. Depending on how humid it is outside, how thick your paint is, or if you're using oil paint, which dries very slowly, you can paint wet on wet, where you're mixing wet colors into wet paint. So I'm decreasing the amount of paint that is on my brush so I can get that to fade, because you notice that these fade as we're going away. You might notice that some of this starts to wipe up. If that happens, what you can do is you can do kind of a wet into wet, and you can take the color that you mixed earlier and you can mix it with your shadow as you go, and that'll help prevent that pickup of that other color that's underneath. Another thing that will help is if you're using gel medium. Most of you do not have that at home, but gel medium is basically clear acrylic paint. So it gives me a little three-dimensional form there. And to really make this pop, I'm going to need to have my highlights. And that highlight includes a reflected light that's up underneath. What happens is the light hits the table, bounces underneath the pear, and when I put that reflected light over here and over here, we're going to be able to see the difference between the table color and the pear color. Reflected light, I'm going to take my white and mix even more of that in, just the barest amount of my original pear color, and see how that matches. And then I can begin to thin that out and glaze that on. And again, this is a curved subject, so I'm using curved strokes that move cross contour with that form. And my goal right now is not to make it be photorealistic. I'm just kind of making this up a little bit as I go to get the sense of a form. The artistry is in making it kind of how I see it, or how I want it to look. It still looks three-dimensional. It's still going to look like a pear, but I'm very focused on mark making. I'm using my picture of my pear to guide me on maybe where I should place my lights and shadows. So there I've got a main light source. I've got reflected light here on this side also, but this is my primary light source. So I'm going to do a brighter highlight inside of my lit side. For this, I'm gonna take some pure white. Oop, that's dry. Get some more. Remember from the first video I showed you, you can take your paints and put them inside of a Ziploc bag or something, cover them up, spray them a little water, and they won't dry out while you're fixing lunch like mine did. So I'm gonna put a lighter highlight inside my light because we like having really nice contrast. Makes things easier to see. And then I'm gonna fade the edges. Try not to blend the middle. I'm gonna fade those edges. Because this is a curved form, my lights and my shadows are not going to have sharp edges. But remember when we did our cubes earlier this year, that the cubes have sharp changes in lights and darks. So there's my light, my shadow, my sort of core light in there, and then I could put in a little core shadow down here, take some of my chromatic black that I had earlier and put a darker dark. Inside my shadow. And I don't really see that as much as I'd like, so sometimes you can use your artistic license to bring that out more. Okay. All we're missing is a stem. The stem seems to be made of that same base color that you see right there. And I'm not going to draw it on, I'm just going to sketch it on with my paintbrush. Painting really is a drawing process, and that drawing is concerned, or it can be a drawing process, and that drawing really is concerned with light, shadow, depth of space. Those are drawing skills. We're just doing it with paint. Now I'm going to put my lights and shadows on my stem. Here's my shaded side. Put some texture on there. Then I need my highlight. It's hitting on the same side as the light part of my pear. Don't overdo it. There we go, we got a pear. You know, you could put these textures and other things on if you want, but it's not necessary, and you can sign your work if you want. I suggest if you're gonna sign your work, sign it with the same media and the same colors, some of the same colors that you worked with in your piece, but you don't have to. I mean, really, unless you're Picasso, most people are buying it for the painting and not your signature. Thank you for tuning in with me 4 weeks in a row. I really miss you guys. I hope you're staying safe and happy and finding things to entertain yourselves other than the computers. Get off the computer. Go paint something. Go make something. Love y'all. Bye.